Deep in the mountains between France and Spain, there lives a people who shouldn't exist. Their language has no connection to any other language on Earth. Their blood types are completely different from their neighbors, and their DNA tells a story so incredible, so impossible, that scientists spent decades refusing to believe it. These are the Basques, and they are Europe's greatest mystery. Picture this. While every other European population shows clear signs of mixing and migration over thousands of years, the Basques stand alone like a genetic island frozen in time. They carry secrets in their blood that date back to the very first humans who set foot on Europe, secrets that challenge everything we thought we knew about human history. But here's where it gets truly bizarre. The Basques don't just have unusual DNA. They speak a language that existed before Latin, before Celtic, before Germanic tongues ever reached European shores. A language so ancient and isolated that linguists call it a ghost from the past. And when you combine this linguistic puzzle with their genetic uniqueness, you get a mystery that has haunted scientists for over a century. What happened to create this impossible people? How did they survive when countless other ancient populations vanished into history? And what does their existence tell us about the deepest secrets of human migration and survival? The answers will take us on a journey through ice ages and invasions, through prehistoric caves and cutting-edge laboratories, through myths and legends that might just be memories of real events lost to time. This is not just the story of one unusual group of people. This is the story of human survival against impossible odds and the incredible lengths life will go to preserve itself. The Basques have been called the living fossils of Europe, but as we're about to discover, they're so much more than that. They're the keepers of humanity's oldest European secrets, and their DNA holds clues that could rewrite the entire story of how our species conquered a continent. Let's begin in the year 1901, in a small laboratory in Vienna, Austria, where a young scientist named Karl Landsteiner was about to make a discovery that would change medicine forever. He was studying blood, trying to understand why some blood transfusions saved lives while others killed patients instantly. What he found were different blood types, and he labeled them A, B, AB, and O. But here's what Landsteiner couldn't have predicted. When scientists began mapping these blood types across different populations, they found something extraordinary. Most Europeans showed a fairly even distribution of all blood types. But in a small region of the Pyrenees Mountains, something was very, very different.
The Basques had the highest concentration of O-negative blood in the world. Not just a little higher than average, but dramatically higher. While most European populations showed around 15% O-negative blood, the Basques showed rates of over 25%, sometimes reaching 30% or more in isolated villages. This was statistically impossible if they were part of the same gene pool as their neighbors. But blood types were just the beginning. As genetic science advanced through the 20th century, each new test revealed the same shocking pattern. The Basques were genetically distinct from every other European population. Not slightly different, completely different. Dr. Cavalli Sforza, one of the pioneers of population genetics, spent decades studying European DNA patterns. In population after population, he found the fingerprints of ancient migrations, invasions, and mixing. Celtic genes mixed with Germanic ones. Roman influences spread across the Mediterranean. Slavic populations showed clear connections to Central Asian nomads. Every group told a story of movement, mixing, and change. except the Basques. When Cavalli Sforza analyzed Basque DNA, he found something that shouldn't exist in modern Europe. The Basques showed almost no signs of genetic mixing with any of the populations that had swept across Europe over the past several thousand years. They were like a genetic time capsule, preserved exactly as they had been thousands of years ago. This raised an uncomfortable question for scientists. If the Basques were truly isolated, truly unchanged, then what exactly were they unchanged from? What were they preserving in their genes? The answer would come from an unexpected source: ancient bones buried in caves across Europe. In 1856, workers in a quarry in Germany's Neander Valley found something strange. Ancient human bones, but not quite like modern human bones. The skull was larger, more robust. The bones were thicker, more muscular. Scientists eventually realized they had found the remains of humanity's closest relatives, the Neanderthals. For over a century, scientists believed that Neanderthals had died out completely, leaving no genetic trace in modern humans. We were separate species, the thinking went. Neanderthals represented an evolutionary dead end, while modern humans went on to populate the world. But in the early 2000s, new genetic techniques finally allowed scientists to extract and analyze DNA from ancient bones. What they found shocked the scientific world. Modern humans didn't just coexist with Neanderthals, they interacted with them. They had children with them.
Every person of European descent carries Neanderthal DNA in their genome. Usually around 1 to 3% of their total genetic makeup comes from these ancient relatives who supposedly died out thousands of years ago. But here's where the Basque mystery deepens even further. When scientists analyzed Basque DNA for Neanderthal ancestry, they found something impossible to explain. The Basques had significantly less Neanderthal DNA than any other European population. In some studies, they showed almost no Neanderthal ancestry at all. This made no sense. The Basques lived in exactly the region where some of the last Neanderthal populations had survived. The caves of northern Spain and southern France are littered with Neanderthal fossils. If anyone should show high levels of Neanderthal ancestry, it should be the people who still lived in those exact same mountains. But the genetic evidence was clear. Somehow, the Basques had avoided mixing with Neanderthals even while living right next to them. Or perhaps something even stranger had happened. Perhaps the Basques represented something else entirely. Dr. Spencer Wells, one of the world's leading experts on human migration, put it this way: the Basques are a genetic mystery wrapped in a linguistic enigma. Their DNA suggested they were the purest descendants of the very first modern humans to reach Europe, but their isolation was so complete it seemed almost impossible. How could a population remain so genetically isolated while living in the middle of one of the world's most traveled regions? The Pyrenees Mountains weren't on some remote island. They sat right between France and Spain, along routes that had been used for traders, armies, and migrants for thousands of years. The answer lay not just in geography, but in something even more mysterious: the Basque language itself. Euskera, as the Basques call their language, is unlike anything else spoken in Europe or anywhere else in the world. It doesn't belong to the Indo-European family like English, Spanish, French, German, and most other European languages. It doesn't belong to the Semitic family like Arabic and Hebrew. It doesn't belong to any known language family at all. Linguists call Euskera a language isolate, meaning it stands completely alone, with no known relatives. as if it dropped from space or emerged from some parallel dimension where human language evolved. But here's what makes Euskera truly extraordinary. The language shows signs of being incredibly ancient, possibly dating back to before the last ice age. Its basic vocabulary, its grammar structure, its way of organizing thought, all point to a time before any other European language existed. Consider this. When the Romans conquered most of Europe, they found Celtic languages in Britain and Gaul, Germanic languages in Northern Europe, and various other tongues that they could at least categorize and partially understand. But when they reached the Basque territories, they found something completely alien. Roman writers described the Basque language as incomprehensible, unlike anything their translators had ever encountered. More remarkably, inscriptions found in Basque territories from Roman times show that Euskera has changed remarkably little over 2,000 years. While Latin evolved into Spanish, French, Italian, and Portuguese tongues, while Germanic languages split into English, German, Dutch, and Scandinavian tongues, Euskera remained essentially the same. This linguistic stability suggests something profound about Basque culture. They weren't just genetically isolated, they were culturally isolated too, maintaining their traditions, their language, and their way of life with a tenacity that seems almost supernatural. But why? What force was strong enough to preserve a people and their language through ice ages, invasions, plagues, and the rise and fall of empires? The answer takes us back to the very beginning of human history in Europe, to a time when the continent was a very different place. 50,000 years ago, Europe was in the grip of the last great ice age. Massive glaciers covered most of the northern continent, pushing south like slow-moving walls of ice. The climate was harsh, the landscape was brutal, and only the most adaptable humans could survive. Archaeological evidence shows that modern humans first reached Europe around 45,000 years ago, migrating from Africa through the Middle East. These were our direct ancestors, the first people who looked and thought essentially like us. But they entered a continent that was already occupied. The Neanderthals had been living in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. They were perfectly adapted to the Ice Age climate, with powerful bodies, large brains, and sophisticated tools. From their perspective, these new arrivals were invaders in a land that belonged to them. What happened next was one of the most important chapters in human history, and it's a story written in Basque DNA.
Most of Europe saw intense competition between modern humans and Neanderthals. Archaeological sites show evidence of violence, territorial disputes, and gradual displacement. Over thousands of years, modern human populations grew, while Neanderthal populations shrank. There was interbreeding, creating hybrid populations that carried genes from both species. But in the mountains of northern Spain and southern France, something different happened. The region that would become the Basque homeland seemed to develop into a kind of refuge zone, a place where small populations of pure modern humans managed to survive without significant mixing with Neanderthals. Perhaps it was geography. The Pyrenees Mountains created natural barriers in isolated valleys where small groups could establish themselves and maintain their genetic integrity. Perhaps it was cultural. Maybe the ancestors of the Basques developed survival strategies that didn't require them to compete directly with Neanderthal populations. Or perhaps it was something even more remarkable. Some scientists have proposed that the Basque ancestors were among the very first modern humans to reach Europe, and they managed to establish themselves so successfully in their mountain territories that they never needed to leave, never needed to migrate, never needed to mix with other populations. Whatever the cause, the result was extraordinary. While the rest of Europe experienced wave after wave of human migration, mixing, and cultural change, the Basque ancestors remained essentially unchanged in their mountain stronghold. Then came the ice. Around 20,000 years ago, the last ice age reached its peak. Glaciers advanced farther south than they had in hundreds of thousands of years. Most of northern Europe became uninhabitable. Human populations that had survived for millennia were forced to flee south, concentrating in a few refuge areas where the climate remained tolerable. One of the most important of these refuge areas was exactly where the Basques live today, the Atlantic coast of Spain and France, protected by the mountains and warmed by ocean currents. Dr. Martin Richards, a geneticist who has spent years studying European population history, describes this period as a genetic bottleneck. Most of the human genetic diversity in Europe today comes from the populations that survived in these southern refuge areas during the Ice Age maximum. When the glaciers retreated, these refuge populations expanded north and repopulated the continent. But here's the crucial point. While other refuge populations expanded and mixed and spread across Europe after the Ice Age ended, the Basques stayed put. They had found their perfect niche in the Pyrenees Mountains, and they saw no reason to leave.
This decision to stay, to remain in their ancestral territory while other populations spread across the continent, is what preserved their genetic uniqueness. They became a living fossil of Ice Age Europe, carrying in their DNA the genetic signature of humanity's earliest successful colonization of the continent. But DNA is just part of the story. The Basques also preserved something else from those ancient times: their language. Euskera contains words and concepts that seem to date back to the end of the Ice Age. The Basque word for axe appears to be related to stone tool technology. Their word for ceiling originally meant cave roof. Their agricultural vocabulary shows signs of being borrowed from other languages, suggesting that the Basques were primarily hunter-gatherers when farming first reached Europe around 7,000 years ago. Most remarkably, Euskera contains what linguists believe are some of the oldest place names in Europe. Rivers, mountains, and valleys across the Pyrenees bear Basque names that have remained unchanged for thousands of years. These aren't just random words. They're a linguistic map of how Ice Age Europeans understood and organized their landscape. Consider the implications. The Basques aren't just carrying ancient genes. They're carrying ancient memories, encoded in their language and passed down through generations for thousands of years. They are living links to a world that vanished everywhere else in Europe. But this raises an even deeper mystery. If the Basques are truly the descendants of Ice Age refugee populations, if they've maintained their genetic and linguistic integrity for tens of thousands of years, then what does this tell us about human nature itself? The Basque survival story suggests that humans have an almost supernatural ability to preserve their identity across impossible spans of time. But it also raises uncomfortable questions about what we've lost. If the Basques represent what Ice Age Europeans were like, then the rest of us are carrying a much more mixed and complex genetic heritage. Are we looking at the pure form of European humanity, preserved in a mountain sanctuary? Or are we looking at something else entirely? The answer becomes even more complex when we consider what happened to the Basques after the Ice Age ended. Around 12,000 years ago, the glaciers began to retreat. Europe slowly warmed, and vast areas that had been frozen wasteland became habitable again. This should have been a time of expansion and prosperity for all human populations, including the Basques. But archaeological evidence suggests something different happened. Instead of expanding their territory, the Basques seemed to contract it. Instead of growing in numbers, their population remained small and isolated. It's as if they made a conscious decision to prioritize cultural preservation over territorial expansion. This pattern continued throughout recorded history. When Celtic tribes swept across Europe around 3,000 years ago, they largely bypassed Basque territories. When Romans conquered most of the known world, they left the Basques semi-autonomous. When Germanic tribes overran the Roman Empire, they established kingdoms all around Basque lands, but never fully conquered them. Later, when Arab armies conquered most of Spain, the Basques maintained their independence in the mountains. When Charlemagne built his European empire, the Basques remained outside it. Even when Spain and France emerged as unified nations, the Basques negotiated special privileges that preserved their traditional autonomy. This isn't just luck. You don't maintain political and cultural independence for thousands of years through accident. The Basques developed survival strategies that were so effective, so deeply ingrained in their culture, that they could resist pressures that destroyed countless other ethnic groups. But what were these strategies? How did a small population in a relatively small territory manage to preserve their identity against such overwhelming odds? Part of the answer lies in Basque social organization. Traditional Basque society was built around the eche, the family farmstead. Each eche was essentially a self-sufficient economic unit, capable of surviving independently if necessary. The eldest child, regardless of gender, inherited the entire property, ensuring that each family unit remained strong and undivided. This system created a society that was both stable and adaptable. Basque communities could weather political storms, economic disruptions, and military invasions because each family unit was fundamentally secure. There was no need to migrate, no pressure to assimilate, no reason to abandon traditional ways of life. But there was something else, something deeper than social organization. The Basques seem to have developed what we might call a cultural immune system, a set of beliefs and practices that automatically resisted outside influence. The Basque language itself served as a barrier to assimilation. Because Euskera was so completely different from any other European language, Basques who learned other languages always remained recognizably Basque. They couldn't disappear into other populations the way speakers of related languages could.
Basque naming traditions also preserved group identity. Basque surnames were typically based on the family farmstead, the eche name. This meant that Basque identity was literally tied to specific pieces of land, creating a connection between people and place that was almost impossible to break. Even Basque religion, though officially Catholic for over 1,000 years, maintained distinctive elements that set it apart from neighboring populations. Basque Christianity incorporated ancient symbols, seasonal festivals, and ritual practices that had clear pre-Christian origins. The Virgin Mary was venerated in ways that suggested much older goddess traditions. Mountain spirits and forest deities survived as Catholic saints. All of these factors worked together to create what scholars call cultural persistence. The Basques didn't just survive as a population, they survived as themselves, maintaining their essential identity across thousands of years of change. But this cultural persistence came at a cost. By choosing preservation over expansion, the Basques remained a small population. By prioritizing identity over adaptation, they sometimes found themselves at a disadvantage compared to more flexible neighbors. The question is whether this trade-off was worth it. What exactly were the Basques preserving, and why was it so important that they were willing to sacrifice growth and power to maintain it? The answer takes us into the realm of human memory and the deepest functions of culture itself. Modern cognitive science tells us that human consciousness is essentially a storytelling mechanism. We understand ourselves through narratives that connect past, present, and future. We know who we are by remembering where we came from and imagining where we're going. For most human populations, this narrative process is constantly being revised. Each generation adapts the story to fit new circumstances. Languages change, traditions evolve, identities shift to match changing conditions. But the Basques seem to have chosen a different path. Instead of constantly revising their story, they decided to preserve it exactly as it was. They became the guardians of humanity's oldest European narrative, the keepers of memories that went back to the very beginning of human presence on the continent. This decision to become memory keepers explains many of the mysteries surrounding Basque culture. Their genetic isolation wasn't just an accident of geography. It was a conscious choice to preserve something irreplaceable. Their linguistic conservatism wasn't just resistance to change. It was dedication to maintaining the oldest human voice in Europe. But what exactly were they remembering? What story were they so determined to preserve?
The answer lies buried in Basque mythology, in the ancient stories that Basque grandmothers still tell children in mountain villages. Basque mythology is filled with references to a time before time, a golden age when humans and nature existed in perfect harmony. There are stories of underground peoples, of mountain spirits, of ancient conflicts between forces of light and darkness. There are tales of great floods, of ice and cold, of times when the world was very different from today. For centuries, scholars dismissed these stories as primitive folklore, quaint remnants of pre-scientific thinking. But modern archaeology and climatology have revealed something extraordinary. Many Basque myths appear to be accurate memories of real historical events. The stories of great cold and ice correspond perfectly with what we know about Ice Age conditions in Europe. The tales of underground peoples match archaeological evidence of Neanderthal populations who lived in caves. The flood myths align with what we know about the rapid climate changes that occurred when the Ice Age ended. Most remarkably, Basque creation myths describe humans emerging from caves in the earth, which is exactly what the archaeological record shows. The oldest modern human sites in Europe are cave systems, and the Basque territories contain some of the most important of these ancient dwellings. Could it be that Basque mythology preserves actual memories of Ice Age Europe? Could their stories be oral histories that have been passed down for tens of thousands of years? The idea seems impossible at first. Oral traditions typically don't survive more than a few centuries without written support. But the Basques had something most other populations lacked: absolute cultural stability. Their language didn't change significantly. Their social structure remained constant. Their territory stayed the same. Under these unique conditions, it's theoretically possible that extremely ancient memories could have been preserved,
The Basques might literally be carrying in their stories the memories of humanity's first successful colonization of Europe. Dr. David Anthony, an archaeologist who specializes in ancient European cultures, puts it this way: the Basques represent a direct link to the deepest layers of European prehistory. They're not just genetically ancient, they're culturally ancient in ways that we are only beginning to understand. This possibility transforms our understanding of what the Basques represent. They're not just an isolated population that happened to survive. They're the conscious guardians of humanity's oldest European memories, the keepers of stories that connect us to our deepest ancestral past.
But this realization also raises profound questions about loss and preservation. If the Basques are carrying memories that the rest of us have forgotten, what does that tell us about the price of progress? What did we lose when we chose adaptation over preservation? These questions become even more complex when we consider what's happening to the Basques today. For the first time in their extraordinary history, Basque culture is facing pressures that their traditional survival strategies might not be able to handle. Modern transportation has broken down the geographical isolation that protected them for millennia. Global media has introduced cultural influences that are harder to resist than any army or empire. Most critically, the Basque language is under unprecedented threat. While Euskera survived the Roman Empire, the Visigothic kingdoms, the Arab conquest, and the rise of modern nation-states, it's struggling against something more subtle, but potentially more devastating: the gradual shift toward global languages and global culture. Young Basques growing up in cities like Bilbao and San Sebastián are increasingly likely to speak Spanish or French as their primary language. They watch the same movies, listen to the same music, and follow the same social media trends as young people everywhere else in the world. This isn't necessarily bad. Modern Basque culture has produced remarkable achievements in art, literature, architecture, and cuisine. The Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao is one of the most celebrated buildings in the world. Basque restaurants earn Michelin stars. Basque athletes compete in international competitions. But each step toward global integration comes at the cost of traditional isolation. Each generation that grows up speaking Spanish or French as a first language is a generation that carries fewer ancient memories, fewer links to that incredible chain of cultural preservation that stretches back to the Ice Age. The question facing the Basques today is the same question that has always faced them. Is preservation worth the price? Is it possible to maintain ancient identity while participating in modern global culture? Some Basque communities are experimenting with new approaches to cultural preservation. They're using modern technology to document and teach traditional practices. They're creating immersion schools where children learn Euskera as a living language. They're developing economic strategies that celebrate Basque identity rather than hiding it. The stakes of this question extend far beyond the Basque territories. If the Basques represent humanity's oldest continuous European culture, then their disappearance would mean the loss of irreplaceable human heritage. We would lose not just a language or a tradition, but a direct link to our species' deepest European roots. More than that, we would lose proof that human cultures can maintain their identity across extraordinary spans of time. The Basque example shows that it's possible for people to choose preservation over expansion, continuity over change, cultural integrity over political power. In an age when most human communities struggle to maintain any stable identity at all, the Basque achievement becomes even more remarkable. But there's another way to look at the Basque story, one that suggests hope rather than loss. Throughout their history, The Basques have shown an almost supernatural ability to adapt their preservation strategies to changing circumstances. They maintained their identity under Roman rule by accepting certain Roman customs while preserving their essential culture. They survived the medieval period by developing legal and political innovations that protected their autonomy. They navigated the rise of modern nation-states by negotiating special arrangements that preserved their traditional rights. Perhaps they can do the same thing with globalization. Perhaps they can find ways to participate in global culture while maintaining their essential identity. Perhaps they can use modern technology to strengthen rather than weaken their ancient traditions. There are already signs that this might be possible. Basque language revival programs are showing remarkable success in areas where Euskera was nearly extinct just a generation ago. Basque cultural organizations are using internet technologies to connect Basque communities around the world. Young Basques are finding ways to express ancient identities through modern art forms. Most encouragingly, genetic research itself has become a tool for cultural preservation. As more Basques participate in DNA studies, they're gaining a deeper understanding of their unique heritage. They're learning that they're not just a small ethnic minority, but the carriers of genetic and cultural treasures that belong to all humanity. This knowledge is creating a new kind of Basque pride, one based not on isolation, but on recognition of their extraordinary contribution to human diversity. Instead of hiding their distinctiveness, young Basques are celebrating it. Instead of abandoning their heritage, they're finding new ways to share it with the world. The ultimate irony is that globalization, the force that seemed most threatening to Basque survival, might actually be creating new opportunities for cultural preservation. For the first time in history, it's possible for small cultures to maintain global connections without losing local identity. It's possible to be both universally human and distinctively Basque.
But success is not guaranteed. The next few decades will be crucial in determining whether the Basques can successfully navigate this transition. The choices made by the current generation of young Basques will determine whether their extraordinary 40,000-year journey of cultural preservation continues into the future. What makes this moment even more significant is what we now know about Basque DNA and what it represents for human understanding. Recent advances in genetic analysis have revealed details about Basque ancestry that were impossible to discover just a few years ago. The most surprising finding is that Basque genetic patterns aren't just ancient, they're foundational to understanding all European population history. Dr. David Reich, a geneticist at Harvard Medical School who specializes in ancient DNA, explains it this way. The Basques are like a genetic time capsule. By studying their DNA, we can see what all Europeans looked like before the great population movements of the Bronze Age and Iron Age. They're not anomalous, they're ancestral. This discovery has revolutionary implications for understanding European history. It suggests that the Basques aren't Europe's most mysterious people. They're Europe's most important people for understanding where all Europeans came from. The genetic patterns preserved in Basque DNA tell the story of the first successful human colonization of Europe. They carry markers from the hunter-gatherer populations who survived the Ice Age. They preserve the genetic signature of humanity's first permanent European settlements. But they also tell a more complex story about human migration and mixing. While the Basques preserved the oldest European genetic patterns, they also show subtle influences from later populations. They're not completely isolated. They're selectively isolated. incorporating some new genetic influences while rejecting others. This selective mixing suggests something remarkable about Basque survival strategies. They survived by very careful cultural filtering, accepting influences that strengthened their core identity while rejecting changes that threatened their core identity.
This discovery transforms our understanding of cultural preservation itself. The Basques didn't maintain their identity by building walls against the outside world. They maintained it by developing incredibly sophisticated mechanisms for deciding what to accept and what to reject from other cultures. These mechanisms were so effective that they operated successfully for thousands of years, allowing the Basques to interact with dozens of different neighboring populations while maintaining their essential genetic and cultural integrity. The implications extend far beyond European history. If the Basques developed successful strategies for long-term cultural preservation, then their example might offer lessons for other populations facing similar challenges today. Indigenous communities around the world are struggling to maintain their identities in the face of globalization. Small languages everywhere are disappearing as global languages dominate communication. Traditional cultures are being overwhelmed by global media and global economic systems. The Basque example suggests survival is possible, but only through very conscious and sophisticated cultural choices. It's not enough to simply resist change. Successful cultural preservation requires the ability to distinguish between changes that strengthen community identity and changes that weaken it. This is perhaps the most important lesson of the Basque story. Cultural survival isn't about staying the same. It's about staying yourself while adapting to changing circumstances. It's about preserving what's essential while accepting what's beneficial. The Basques mastered this balance thousands of years before anyone understood the scientific principles behind it. They developed what we might now call cultural sustainability, the ability to maintain identity across generations while adapting to environmental and social changes. But their success also depended on factors that might be impossible to replicate today. They had geographical advantages that protected them from overwhelming outside pressures. They had small population sizes that made consensus decision-making possible. They had linguistic barriers that automatically filtered cultural influences. Most importantly, they had time. Their cultural strategies developed over thousands of years, refined through countless generations of trial and error. Modern populations facing similar challenges don't have the luxury of millennia to develop survival strategies. This raises profound questions about the future of human cultural diversity. If the Basque achievement required such unique circumstances, can it be replicated anywhere else? Or are we witnessing the end of the kind of deep cultural distinctiveness that the Basques represent?
The answer may depend on how we choose to value cultural diversity itself. If we see it as important, if we recognize that genetic and cultural uniqueness represents irreplaceable human heritage, then we might find ways to create conditions that support cultural preservation. But if we prioritize efficiency, uniformity, and global integration above all else, then the Basque achievement might remain forever unique, a reminder of human possibilities that we chose not to pursue. The Basques themselves seem determined to prove that cultural preservation and global participation can coexist. They're pioneering new approaches to identity maintenance that use modern tools to strengthen ancient traditions. Basque language immersion programs are incorporating cutting-edge educational techniques. Basque cultural organizations are using social media to connect diaspora communities. Basque businesses are finding ways to market their products globally while emphasizing their unique cultural origins. Most remarkably, young Basques are using genetic research itself as a tool for cultural revival. As they learn more about their unique ancestry, they're gaining a deeper appreciation for what they've inherited and what they're responsible for preserving. This scientific validation of Basque uniqueness is creating new forms of cultural pride. Instead of seeing themselves as a marginalized minority, many Basques now understand themselves as the guardians of irreplaceable human heritage. Instead of hiding their distinctiveness, they're celebrating it as a contribution to global human diversity. The transformation is visible everywhere in Basque territories. Ancient symbols appear on modern buildings. Traditional festivals incorporate contemporary art forms. Old recipes are being revived in innovative restaurants. The Basque language is being taught through smartphone apps and virtual reality programs. What we're witnessing might be the emergence of a new model for cultural preservation, one that uses global tools to strengthen local identity rather than weaken it. If successful, this model could offer hope for other endangered cultures around the world. But success is still uncertain. The forces threatening cultural diversity are powerful and persistent. Economic pressures favor uniformity over uniqueness. Global media promotes shared experiences over local traditions. International migration creates populations that are more mixed and mobile than ever before. The Basques are fighting these pressures with tools and strategies that would have been unimaginable to their ancestors. But they're fighting for the same goal that has motivated their culture for thousands of years: the preservation of something precious and irreplaceable.
Whether they succeed will depend partly on their own choices and partly on choices made by the larger global community. If the world values cultural diversity, if we recognize that genetic and linguistic uniqueness represents irreplaceable human heritage, then we'll find ways to support and protect populations like the Basques. But if we continue to prioritize efficiency and uniformity over diversity and distinctiveness, then the Basque achievement might represent the end of an era rather than the beginning of a new approach to cultural preservation. The stakes could not be higher. The Basques carry in their genes and their language direct links to humanity's deepest European roots. They preserve memories and knowledge that exist nowhere else on Earth. Their disappearance would represent a loss of human heritage that could never be recovered. But their survival as a distinct culture would prove something equally important. It would demonstrate that human communities can maintain their essential identity while participating fully in global civilization. It would show that diversity and unity are not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of human flourishing. The choice is ours, both as individuals and as a global community. We can support the kind of cultural preservation that the Basques represent, or we can allow it to disappear in favor of cultural uniformity. But before we make that choice, we should fully understand what we're choosing between. The Basque story reveals something profound about human nature and human possibilities. It shows us that our species is capable of extraordinary dedication to identity preservation, that human communities can maintain themselves across impossible spans of time, and that cultural diversity represents one of our most remarkable achievements. The Basques have been called Europe's most mysterious people, but they're really something much more important. They're proof of human potential, evidence of what our species can accomplish when it commits itself to preserving something precious. Their DNA tells the story of humanity's first successful colonization of Europe. Their language preserves memories from the dawn of European civilization. Their culture demonstrates strategies for survival that have worked for thousands of years. Most importantly, their continued existence proves that human diversity is not just possible, but sustainable. That different approaches to human life can coexist and enrich each other. That our species is strengthened rather than weakened by maintaining multiple ways of being human. As we face an uncertain future filled with pressures toward uniformity and homogenization, the Basque example reminds us that alternatives are possible. Their 40,000-year journey from Ice Age survivors to modern global citizens shows us that identity and adaptation can work together, that preservation and progress are not mutually exclusive.
The bizarre truth about Basque DNA is not just that it's ancient and unique. The bizarre truth is that it proves human communities can choose to preserve themselves across unimaginable spans of time, maintaining their essential identity while adapting to whatever challenges the world presents. This is perhaps the most important lesson the Basques have to teach us. In a world that seems to be losing its diversity, they remind us that different choices are possible. In an age that seems to demand conformity, they prove that distinctiveness can survive and thrive. Their story is not just about one remarkable people in the mountains between France and Spain. It's about human possibility itself, about the lengths our species will go to preserve what it values most, about the incredible tenacity of identity and memory, and the surprising ways that ancient wisdom can survive in a modern world. But the Basque story also contains a warning. Their success required circumstances that may never exist again. They needed geographical protection, cultural isolation, and thousands of years to develop their survival strategies. They needed small populations where consensus was possible, and linguistic barriers that automatically filtered outside influences. Most critically, they needed to make choices that prioritized long-term cultural survival over short-term advantages. They chose preservation over expansion, identity over power, continuity over change. These choices allowed them to survive when countless other populations disappeared, but they also limited their numbers and their influence. Today's threatened cultures face similar choices, but without the luxury of time or isolation that the Basques enjoyed. They must develop preservation strategies in decades rather than millennia, while fully exposed to global pressures that are more intense than anything the Basques ever faced. The question is whether the Basque model can be adapted to these new circumstances. Can other populations learn from Basque strategies without requiring Basque conditions? Can the principles of cultural preservation be applied in a world where geographical isolation is impossible and linguistic barriers are increasingly irrelevant? The answer may lie in understanding what the Basques actually preserved and why it was worth preserving. When scientists analyze Basque DNA, they're not just looking at genetic markers. They're looking at the preserved record of humanity's first successful adaptation to European conditions. The Basques carry in their genes the solutions that allowed our species to survive and thrive in a challenging environment.
When linguists study Euskera, they're not just analyzing an unusual language, they're examining the preserved thought patterns of Ice Age Europeans, the ways that our ancestors organized their understanding of the world around them. When anthropologists study Basque culture, they're not just documenting one ethnic group's traditions, they're studying successful strategies for community survival that have been tested across thousands of years of changing conditions. In other words, what the Basques preserved isn't just their own identity,
They preserved knowledge and wisdom that belongs to all humanity. Their genetic patterns tell us about our common European ancestry. Their language preserves ancient ways of understanding the world. Their cultural strategies demonstrate proven methods for long-term community survival. This realization transforms the stakes of Basque cultural survival. If the Basques disappear as a distinct people, we don't just lose one more ethnic minority, we lose irreplaceable knowledge about human adaptation and survival. We lose genetic information that could be crucial for understanding European population history. We lose linguistic evidence that could unlock secrets about the development of human consciousness itself. Most importantly, we lose proof that human communities can successfully resist the pressures that have destroyed so many other cultures. The Basque example shows that cultural preservation is possible, even under extremely difficult circumstances. Their disappearance would suggest that such preservation is no longer feasible in the modern world. This perspective explains why Basque survival has become important to people who have no Basque ancestry at all. Scientists, historians, linguists, and anthropologists worldwide recognize that the Basques represent something larger than themselves. They're the keepers of human heritage that benefits everyone. But this recognition also creates new pressures on Basque communities. Instead of simply preserving their own identity for their own sake, they're now asked to preserve it for the sake of global human heritage. Instead of being allowed to evolve naturally, they're expected to maintain themselves as living museums of ancient human culture. These expectations can be just as threatening to cultural survival as outright persecution. When a culture becomes too self-conscious about its historical importance, it can lose the natural spontaneity that keeps traditions alive. When preservation becomes an obligation rather than an instinct, it can become a burden that younger generations reject. The challenge facing the Basques today is finding ways to honor their extraordinary heritage while remaining a living, growing, changing culture. They need to preserve what's irreplaceable while allowing what's natural to evolve. They need to maintain their role as humanity's memory keepers while creating new memories of their own.
This balance is visible in contemporary Basque culture. In cities like Bilbao and Donostia San Sebastian, ancient Basque symbols appear on ultra-modern buildings. Traditional Basque sports like pelota are played in high-tech facilities. Basque musicians blend ancient folk melodies with contemporary electronic sounds. Most remarkably, the Basque language itself is being revitalized through methods that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. Children learn Euskera through interactive computer programs. Adults practice conversation through smartphone apps. Basque literature is being translated into dozens of languages, spreading Basque stories to global audiences for the first time in history. These innovations suggest that the Basques are successfully adopting their preservation strategies to modern circumstances. Instead of relying solely on geographical isolation, they're creating cultural technologies that maintain identity through conscious choice rather than accidental separation. The results are encouraging. Basque language use is actually increasing in some areas where it had been declining for decades. Young Basques are expressing pride in their heritage rather than embarrassment about their differences. Basque cultural organizations are attracting support from around the world. But the ultimate test of these new strategies will come over the next several generations. The Basques have survived ice ages, invasions, plagues, and the rise of modern nation-states. Can they survive globalization, internet culture, and the unprecedented mobility of modern life? The answer will depend partly on choices made by Basque communities themselves, but also on choices made by the larger world. If global culture learns to value diversity over uniformity,
If we recognize that genetic and linguistic uniqueness represents irreplaceable human heritage, then populations like the Basques have a chance to thrive. But if we continue to prioritize efficiency and standardization over diversity and distinctiveness, then even the most sophisticated preservation strategies may not be enough to maintain truly unique cultures. The Basque example suggests that survival is possible, but only through constant adaptation and conscious effort. Cultural preservation in the modern world requires the same kind of sophisticated decision-making that allowed the Basques to survive for thousands of years. The ability to distinguish between changes that strengthen identity and changes that threaten it. This lesson extends far beyond the Basque territories. Indigenous communities around the world are grappling with similar challenges. Small languages everywhere are competing with global languages for speakers. Traditional knowledge systems are being displaced by modern science and technology.
The Basque model suggests that survival strategies exist, but they require unprecedented levels of cultural consciousness and community coordination. They require the ability to use modern tools to strengthen ancient traditions rather than replace them. Most importantly, they require the recognition that cultural diversity itself is valuable, that human communities benefit from maintaining multiple approaches to life, and that uniqueness is a resource worth preserving rather than an obstacle to be overcome. The bizarre truth about Basque DNA ultimately reveals something profound about human nature. Our species is capable of extraordinary dedication to identity preservation. We can maintain communities across impossible spans of time. We can adapt to changing circumstances while preserving essential characteristics. But we can also lose irreplaceable heritage through neglect or indifference. We can allow uniformity to overwhelm diversity. We can choose efficiency over uniqueness and lose treasures that can never be recovered. The Basques represent both the potential and the vulnerability of human cultural achievement. Their 40,000-year journey from Ice Age survivors to modern global citizens demonstrates what our species can accomplish when it commits itself to preservation and adaptation. Their current struggles to maintain identity in a globalized world reflect challenges facing human diversity everywhere. Their success or failure in navigating these challenges will help determine whether our species maintains its remarkable cultural variety or gradually converges toward uniformity. The stakes extend beyond any single population. If communities like the Basques can successfully preserve their distinctiveness while participating in global civilization, they prove that diversity and unity can coexist. They demonstrate that human flourishing depends not on choosing between local identity and global participation, but on finding ways to combine them successfully. But if unique populations like the Basques gradually disappear into global mainstream culture, we lose more than just individual communities. We lose proof that alternatives to cultural homogenization are possible. We lose models for the kind of sophisticated cultural preservation that might be necessary for human communities to maintain their identities in an increasingly connected world. The Basque story is still being written. The choices made by the current generation of Basques and by the global community that now recognizes their importance will determine whether their extraordinary preservation achievement continues into the future or becomes a remarkable historical footnote. What makes their story so compelling is not just its uniqueness, but its universality. Every human community faces pressures to change, to adapt, to become something different than what it was. The Basque example shows that it's possible to respond to these pressures while maintaining essential identity. Their DNA tells us where we came from. Their language preserves ancient ways of understanding the world. Their culture demonstrates strategies for survival that have been tested across thousands of years. Most importantly, their continued existence proves that human diversity is not just an accident of history, but an achievement that requires constant effort and conscious choice to maintain. They remind us that our species is strengthened by maintaining multiple approaches to human life, multiple ways of organizing communities, multiple strategies for understanding and adapting to the world. As we face an uncertain future filled with pressures toward uniformity, the Basque example offers both inspiration and instruction. They show us that preservation is possible, but only through sophisticated strategies that balance identity maintenance with adaptive change. They prove that small communities can survive alongside large ones, that unique cultures can contribute to rather than detract from global civilization, and that human diversity represents one of our species' greatest achievements rather than an obstacle to overcome. The bizarre truth about Basque DNA is ultimately a truth about human potential itself. We are capable of preserving what we value across unimaginable spans of time. We can maintain our essential identities while adapting to whatever challenges the world presents. We can choose diversity over uniformity, uniqueness over standardization, cultural richness over cultural simplification. But these achievements require conscious effort, sophisticated strategies, and the recognition that what we preserve today determines what future generations will inherit from us. The Basques have given us a 40,000-year example of successful cultural preservation. Whether we learn from their example and apply their lessons to our own preservation challenges will determine what kind of human future we create. Their story reminds us that we are not passive victims of historical forces, but active participants in shaping human destiny. We can choose to preserve what's precious, to maintain what's irreplaceable, and to pass on to future generations the full richness of human cultural achievement. The Basques have made that choice for thousands of years. Now, it's our turn to decide what we will preserve, how we will adapt, and what legacy we will leave for the generations that follow us. Their bizarre and beautiful survival story shows us that the choice is ours to make and that the stakes could not be higher.